Good afternoon, students. So in this video, I am going to discuss about the limits of trigonometric functions. But before we move forward, I would like to tell you that for us to solve the limits of a trigonometric functions, these are the formulas na gagamitin natin. Or should I say, ito yung magiging guide natin in solving the limits of trigonometric functions. The first one is the limit of sine x over x as x approaches to 0 is equal to 1. The limit of x over sine x as x approaches to 0 is equal to 1. The limit of 1 minus cosine x over x as x approaches to 0 is equal to 0. And we have the limit of tangent x over x as x approaches to 0 is equal to 1. So this will be our guide in solving the limits of trigonometric functions. And aside from that, syempre, dapat master din natin ang prerequisite or this should be the prerequisite skills in finding the limits of a trigonometric functions. Ito po ay ang trigonometric identities. Okay? So I will be uploading a list of formula of trigonometric identities. So in the topic of limits of trigonometric function, it is really need for us. So it's a need for us to master the trigonometric identities. Dapat master natin ang trigonometric identities kasi it will help us to manipulate, para mag-manipulate ng trigonometric functions. Okay, so let's have our first example. The limit of sine 4x over x as x approaches to 0. Now, how are we going to find the limit of this trigonometric function? Mapapansin natin, if we substitute directly yung 0, the answer would be undefined. So, try natin dito lang ha. So, let's say if we substitute 0, so it becomes sine 0 over 0. So this becomes sine 0 over 0 or 0 over 0. So indeterminate or undefined. So ang gagawin natin, since we cannot directly substitute 0 kasi magiging undefined yung sagot natin, ang gagawin natin, we are going to apply the formula. We can apply our formula. Gagamitin natin yung formula natin and with the knowledge also of the trigonometric identities. Okay. So for this one, the sine 4x over x, ang gagawin lang natin, dapat maging sine x over x siya for us, for the function to be equal to 1. Ngayon, if we have 4x, dapat yung denominator natin, etong denominator, dapat 4x din siya. Para sine 4x over 4x, that would be equal to 1. Now, ano yung gagawin natin para yung denominator natin maging 4x? Ang gagawin natin para yung denominator natin maging 4x, is syempre, i-multiply natin ang ating numerator and our denominator with 4 over 4. Sige, let's try that one. Solution. Ang purpose natin ay maging 4x ang ating denominator. Kapag naging 4x ang ating denominator, sine x over 4x, that is equal to 1. Solution. So the limit of x approaches to 0, we have the sine 4x over x. So i-multiply natin to by 4 over 4. Okay. Pag minultiply natin yan sa 4 over 4, ang mangyayari is this becomes 4 times sine 4x. So this becomes the limit of 4 times sine 4x over 4x. As x approaches to 0, yung 4, which is constant, pwede nating ilipat sa left side ng limit. So this become 4 limit of sine 4x over 4x as x approaches to 0. And mapapansin natin, meron na tayong sine 4x over 4x. Based sa ating formula, ito yung formula natin, it says the limit of sine x over x as x approaches to 0 is equal to 1. Ibig sabihin, kung meron tayong sine 4x over 4x, I mean the limit of sine 4x over 4x as x approaches to 0, this becomes 1. Okay? This becomes 1. So, ang mangyayari, ang magiging final answer natin, this becomes 4, limit of 1. Okay? I'll just put an equal sign here. Limit of 1 as x approaches to 0. So, the limit of a constant is a constant. So, therefore, this becomes 4 times 1, or our final answer is equal to 4. Okay? So that's how we find the limit of a trigonometric function. Okay, let's have another example. Let's say our second example is like this. The limit of sine 2x, okay, so I'll just put, wait. The limit of 2x over, the limit of sine 2x over 5x as x approaches to 0. Yan. Again, kung isa-substitute natin directly ang 0 sa ating function, that would result to magiging undefined siya. So, ang gagawin natin, we need to apply a formula. Okay? So, dahil ito ay sine 2x over 5x, dapat ang kanyang denominator ay kailangan maging 2x. Okay? Anong gagawin natin para yung denominator natin maging 2x? Okay? So, ang gagawin natin, syempre, we need to find a number being multiplied together to that function that would result as we go along the process maging sine 2x over 2x. Okay. So, ano yung gagawin natin? Let's have our solution. Sulat lang muna natin. So, this becomes the limit of sine 2x. Isi-separate ko yung 5 and x. So, separate ko yan. Separate. So, this becomes sine over x. And then, I multiply this to 1 over 5. It's just the same. Sine 2x over x is just the same as, sine 2x over 5x is the same as sine 2x over x times 1 over 5. Sineparate ko lang si 5 as x approaches to 0. Now, the purpose is, ang purpose natin ay maging 2x ang ating denominator. Dapat ang denominator natin ay maging 2x para sine 2x over 2x, that is equal to 1. Ano yung gagawin natin? So, ang gagawin natin is i-multiply natin ang ating function by 2 over 2. Okay? Let's multiply this by 2 over 2. 2 over 2 is just equal to 1. So, kapag minultiply natin yan sa 2 over 2, okay, so this becomes the limit of sine, sulat na natin, 2 times 1, this is 2, sine 2x, okay, ulitin lang natin. So this becomes sine 2x, 2 sine 2x over, ito, we multiply them together. That is 2x and then 5. Okay. So it becomes, ayusin lang natin. So this becomes 2 over 5 times sine 2x over 2x. as x approaches to 0. Yan. Pwede na nating ilagay yung 2 over 5 sa left side ng limit. So 2 over 5, the limit of sine 2x over 2x as x approaches to 0. Again, based from our formula, the formula says the limit of sine x over x as x approaches to 0 is equal to 1. So, ibig sabihin, ang ating itong sine 2x over 2x, the limit of sine 2x over 2x as x approaches to 0, this becomes equal to 1. So, mag-i-equal to 1 siya. So, we have 2 over 5, the limit of 1 as x approaches to 0, finding the limit of that becomes 2 over 5 times 1, or our final answer is equal to 2 over 5. So the limit of sine 2x over 5x as x approaches to 5x is equal to 2 over 5. Yan, sulat lang natin dito ang ating final answer. So final answer here is 4. And the final answer here is 2 over 5. Now let's have another example. Let's say we have, okay, next example naman natin is, let's say we use the cosine naman, the cosine. Okay, so for our example number 3, okay, let's say we have the limit of 1 minus cosine x over sine x as x approaches to 0. Again, mapapansin natin kung iso-substitute natin directly yung x ay yung value ng x sa ating function, that would result to undefined. Magiging undefined yan kasi 1 minus cosine 0 over sine 0, that is 1 minus 1 over 0. Ipakita ko na lang. So this is 1 minus cosine x over sine x. Palitan natin yung x ng 0, it becomes 1 minus cosine 0 over sine 0. So 1 minus cosine 0 is 1, over sine 0 ay 0. So this is 0 over 0, and this is undefined. Undefined or does not exist. Kaya ang gagawin natin, we need to use a formula and yung skills natin when it comes to manipulating trigonometric identities. Okay, so ano kayang gagawin natin for us to solve this problem or for us to find the limit of this problem? So we have 1 minus cosine x over sine x. Okay. So ang gagawin natin, yung numerator, i-divide na, i-multiply natin sa 1 over x. Or should I say, ang gagawin natin, as I said a while ago, yung numerator, i-multiply natin sa 1 over x, at ang denominator natin, i-multiply din natin sa 1 over x. 1 over x over 1 over x is just equal to 1. Sige, ganun ang gawin natin. So the limit of 1 minus cosine x, okay, multiplied by 1 over x. So, i-multiply natin sa 1 over x. Pag binultiply natin sa 1 over x, so automatically this becomes 1 minus cosine x over x. Para ganito lang siya. 1 minus cosine x multiplied to 1 over x. Kaya ang sagot natin is 1 minus cosine x over x. Over yung denominator din natin, sine x multiplied to 1 over x. This becomes sine x over x. Yan. So, sine x over x. As x, okay, dapat nasa gitna to. The limit as x approaches to 0. Okay? So let's try to solve. So 1 minus cosine x over sine x over x. Now, mapapansin natin, kung isusubstitute natin, try natin. Okay. So 1 minus cosine x. Okay, so erase ko lang muna pala to. Now, let's find the limit of 1 minus cosine x over x and the limit of sine x over x. Ayan. Okay, let's separate them. Separate natin. So this becomes the limit of 1 minus cosine x over x as x approaches to 0 over the limit of sine x over x as x approaches to 0. Ngayon, what is the limit of 1 minus cosine x over x as x approaches to 0? Okay, so let's go back to our formula. Balikan natin ang ating formula. Yan, mapapansin nyo, ito siya. Sabi sa ating formula, it says, ito siya, oh, the limit of 1 minus cosine x over x as x approaches to 0 is equal to 1. So, ibig sabihin, for us to find the limit of 1 minus cosine x as x approaches to 0, this becomes 0. Okay? And based also from our formula that the limit of sine x over x as x approaches to 0 is equal to 1. So this is equal to 1. Sorry. 0 nalagay ko. So this is equal to 1. So therefore, this is 0 over 1. Okay? And the limit is equal to 0. Okay? So the limit of 1 minus cosine x over sine x as x approaches to 0 is equal to 0. Okay? Hindi siya undefined, but equal to 0. Okay? So, now let's have another example. Let's say we have, ano kaya? Okay, this one. Let's say we need to find the limit of this one. The limit of tangent x minus sine x over sine x cubed, sine cube x as x approaches to 0. Okay. So para ma-solve natin ang trigonometric function na to, para ma-solve natin ang kanyang limit, we need to apply yung nalalaman natin sa trigonometric identities. Ngayon, kapag medyo nakalimutan na natin, let's review on that, mag-review tayo. O di kaya naman, gawing handy natin. Habang nagsosolve tayo, pwede tayong tumingin sa ating trigonometric identities. Okay? Kung may a-apply ba natin siya kapag nagsosolve tayo ng problem. I mean, kung alin doon ang mai-apply natin, okay, sa trigonometric identities. Pero kung kabisado natin, mas advantage yun sa atin kasi habang nagsosolve tayo, mai-apply na natin agad kung ano yung tamang solution or tamang trigonometric identities na kailangan nating i-apply. So solution, finding for the limit of this one. So the limit of yung tangent x, sige, copy ko lang muna. The tangent x minus sine x over sine cube x as x approaches to 0. Okay, so we all know, kung titingin tayo sa ating trigonometric identities, pwede nating tingnan doon yung value ng tangent x. Okay, the limit of, and the value of tangent x or our tangent x is also equal to sine x over cosine x. Ayan. Nasa trigonometric identities natin to. So, ang mangyayari, this becomes yung tangent x natin, ito, tangent x, papalitan lang natin ng sin x over cosine x. So this becomes, sin x over cosine x minus, copy as is ko lang, sin x over sin cube x as x approaches to 0. Okay? And then combine natin yung sin x over cosine x minus sin x. Ayan. So, ayan. I'll just erase lang this one. Erase ko lang. Okay. So, again, gawing handy natin ang ating trigonometric identities. Ayan. So, ayusin ko lang ulit. Oops. Sana yan. Okay, this one. Okay. Now, sin x, oops, lagyan ko lang ng paper. Sana. Okay. Now, i-combine natin yung sin x over cosine x minus sin x. Yes. Yan. So, cosine x minus sin x. Paano ba i-manipulate to? Kapag ganito, parang nagmamanipulate lang tayo ng fraction. Parang 2/3 minus, let's say minus 1. How do we add 2/3 minus 1? Di ba ang ginagawa natin, para mas madali, we multiply 3 with 1. So this becomes 2 minus 3 times 1 over 3. So yun yung basic ng fraction. Now, applying that to this one, sin x over cosine x minus sin x, this becomes, directly multiply na natin para hindi na tayo mahirapan. That would be the process. So sin x minus cosine x times sin x, or this becomes sin x cosine x over cosine x. So, isulat natin dito. The limit of sin x minus sin x cosine x over sin cube x. Okay. Over, meron pa mali. Okay. This is not yet sin x cube. This is cosine x. Cosine x over the sin cube x. As x approaches to 0. Center lang natin. As x approaches to 0. So, as x, limit of, usin lang natin pagsulat, rewrite ko lang. The limit of as x approaches to 0. Okay, so the next process, sin x and cosine x over, the sin x minus sin x times cosine x over cosine x over sin cube x. Okay, so this becomes the limit of yung sin x minus cosine x Now, we factor out lang natin ang ating numerator, which is sin x minus sin x times cosine x. So, this can be rewrite as sin x 1 minus cosine x. Kung i-distribute natin to, yan, ito din ang kalalabasan yan. Okay? So, nire-write lang natin. So, we just rewrite it. Okay. Oops. Over over cosine x over the sine cube x as x approaches to 0. Now, ang gawin natin, yung sine x times 1 minus cosine x over cosine x, i-divide natin sa sine cube x, or this can be written as the limit of sine x 1 minus cosine x over cosine x. Kapag i-divide natin, ang mangyayari ay magiging divided by sine cube x, or this can be written as, pwedeng ganito, multiply natin sa 1 over sine cube x. Okay? As x approaches to 0. Continue lang natin, the limit of, copy lang natin yung nasa taas. Sine x, 1 minus cosine x, kasi being multiplied to 1, you will get the same result, sine x pa din times 1 minus cosine x. And then cosine x, and then sine cube x. Now, pwede tayong mag-cancel dito, yung isang sine x dito, at saka yung isang sine x dito. So, ang mangyayari, ito ay magiging sine squared x na lang. Magiging sine squared x na lang siya. Okay, let's continue solving. The limit of, ang matitira na lang sa taas is 1 minus cosine x over cosine x sine squared x as x approaches to 0. Okay, so the limit of 1 minus cosine x, okay, over cosine x, at itong sine squared x, kung titingnan natin ang ating trigonometric identities, ang ating sine squared x, this is also equal to 1 minus cosine squared x. So, ibig sabihin, etong sine squared x natin, papalitan lang natin ng 1 minus cosine squared x. Oops. Okay. So, this becomes 1 minus cosine squared x as x approaches to 0. Erase ko na to. So, ayan, napakahalaga na kabisado natin ang trigonometric identities. Is equal to the limit of, copy ko lang yung numerator natin, cosine x, as x approaches 0, and then, ang denominator natin, yung 1 minus cosine squared x, 1 cosine squared x, this can be written also as 1 minus cosine squared x times 1, wala na siyang square, kasi factor out pala natin, wala na siyang square, and then 1 plus cosine x. Yan. So, yung 1 minus cosine square x, this also can be written as 1 minus cosine x, 1 plus cosine x. Ayan. Nasa trigonometric identities din natin yan. So, ganyan natin siya i-factor out. And moving forward, merong makakancel dito. This is the 1 minus cosine x and the 1 minus cosine x. Ang matitira na lang, the limit of 1 over cosine x, 1 plus cosine x as x approaches to 0. Okay, so this becomes the limit of, substitute na natin yung 0 sa x. Yan, cosine 0, 1 plus cosine 0. This becomes 1 over, cosine 0 is equal to 1 plus, it's not plus, multiplied to 1 plus cosine 0 is equal to 1. So, cosine 0 is equal to 1. So, solve lang natin to. This is 1 over 1 times 2 or 1 over 1/2. So our final answer is equal to 1/2. Okay. If you have questions, you just message me so I can assist you. So that's how we solve the limits of trigonometric functions. So napakahalaga na kabisado natin or alam natin ang trigonometric identities at yung mga formulas na nasa screen natin. So ito yung mahalaga for us to solve the trigonometric functions. Okay? Again, kapag may tanong, pwede nyo akong i-message. Okay? Sige, magbigay pa ako ng isang example. Let's add another one. Kasi parang puno na. Okay. Let's have another example. Okay. Let's say, ang given naman natin ay, this is example 5. The limit of 1 minus cosine x over x square as x approaches to 0. So 1 minus cosine square, I mean 1 minus cosine x over x square as x approaches to 0. So solution. Copy lang natin. This is the limit of 1 minus cosine x over x square as x approaches to 0. Now, ano yung gagawin natin? So, kailangan natin itong i-manipulate para ang maging sagot natin is not undefined. Kasi kung i-substitute natin directly yung 0, ang magiging sagot natin ay equal to undefined siya. Now, ang gagawin natin, 1 minus cosine x. Naalala nyo kanina yung formula ng the cosine, 1 minus cosine square. Okay. Sulat ko lang dito ha. Sine square x is equal to 1 minus cosine square x. Yan. Pinakita ko to kanina. And then, pinakita ko din na the 1 minus cosine square x is equal to 1 minus cosine x times 1 plus cosine x. Now, kung matatanong nyo, saan to galing ng mga sinasabi ko? Ito po ay galing sa ating trigonometric identities. Okay? Ito po ay galing sa ating trigonometric identities. So, magagamit natin siya dito. Now, kung meron tayong 1 minus cosine x, ang ating limit of function na trigonometric function, i-multiply natin siya sa kanyang conjugate. So, the limit of 1 minus cosine x, i-multiply natin siya sa 1 plus cosine x. Okay? Over x square, multiply to 1 plus cosine x over 1 plus cosine x. Ngayon, ano yung purpose ko kung bakit ko siya minultiply sa kanyang conjugate? The purpose is para yung numerator natin ay maging sine square x. Kapag sine square x ang ating numerator, mas madali na sa atin to find all the limits and mas madali para sa atin i-manipulate ang ating trigonometric functions. Okay, simplifying, this becomes the limit of, so technically multiplying this together, this would give us 1 minus cosine square x over x square times 1 plus cosine x. As x approaches to 0. And itong 1 minus cosine square x, ang ating numerator, this is also equal to sine square x. So papalitan ko lang ang ating numerator. Ang ating numerator magiging sine square x na siya. So the limit of this becomes sine square x. Ito lang yan na, equal lang sila. The 1 minus cosine square x ay equal lang kay sine square x over x square plus, times 1 plus cosine x as x approaches 0. Ayan, sabi sa ating formula, magiging, ang limit ng sin x over x ay equal to 1. So, tingnan natin kung ma-manipulate natin siya. So, ang mangyayari dito, the limit of, as x approaches to 0, separate natin sila, sin square x over x square, yan, multiply sa, eto pa din, 1 plus cosine x. Nire-write ko lang siya, pero they are still the same. Ayan. And then, the limit of, itong sin square x over x square, this can be written as, pwede natin siyang isulat na sin x over x square. Okay? Same lang yan sila. They are the same lang. Yung sin square x over x square ay same lang po yan sa sin x over x square. They are the same lang. Okay? And then, times 1 over 1 plus cosine x as x approaches to 0. So we have the limit of x approaches to 0. So sin x over x, alam na natin, based sa ating formula, ito po ay equal to 1. Okay, based sa ating formula yan this is equal to 1, the sin x over x, yung limit niyan. Kaya, ang mangyayari, okay, ano na natin, substitute na natin. So that becomes 1. It becomes 1. So therefore, 1 times 1 over 1. Ay, wait lang. Ayusin lang natin. 1 plus cosine 0. Yan. 1 over 1 plus cosine 0 is 1. Kaya we have 1 times 1/2, or our final answer is 1/2. So therefore, the limit of 1 minus cosine x over x squared as x approaches to 0 is equal to 1/2. You have questions? Again, message lang ako kapag may tanong kayo. Okay? Kapag nalilito, tanong lang po.